So we're going to look at how are science, tentative science, and pseudoscience each defined. We want to know their definitions, and we want to be able to apply those definitions. So in our Venn diagram, we have science on the left circle, pseudoscience in the right circle, and anything that applies to both science and pseudoscience goes in the center intersecting part of the two circles. So the first thing that we want to write down is how each is presented. They're both presented as sound science, but only science has actually gone through the rigorous process of peer review. Pseudoscience has not. Now, the pseudoscience might not have gone through the peer review process either because it hasn't gone through it yet or because it's impossible to go through it because it's some belief, for example, that cannot be tested, so therefore it can't go through rigorous review. The next thing that differentiates them is what drives them. Science is driven by evidence, whereas pseudoscience is driven more by cultural or commercial, in other words, monetary goals. So science must be something that can be tested in order to verify the claim. So therefore, because it can be tested with an experiment, that experiment can be replicated by other scientists so that they can validate the results that the previous scientist obtained. Pseudoscience either can't be or they don't want it to be tested and verified and replicated by other scientists. Science is unbiased. It follows the data wherever it goes. If it supports their claim, that's great. And if it rejects it, that's okay too. They just follow the data wherever it goes. Whereas pseudoscience is biased. They have a preconceived conclusion that they want to go find data to support what they believe. So they will cherry pick the data, which means that they go out of their way to find data that supports what they believe, and they reject any data that contradicts what they believe. Science is excited and happy about peer review. They want skeptical questions. They want their peers to review their work and give them critiques on how it could be improved. Whereas pseudoscience is the exact opposite. They want nothing to do with peer review or skepticism or any suggestion or data that contradicts what they are trying to present as the final word. So science is open-minded, whereas pseudoscience is closed-minded. They do not want, pseudoscience does not want other viewpoints. So science, because it's driven by evidence, that this knowledge can be revised, it can be modified, it can be built upon. That's really the cornerstone of science. Whereas pseudoscience is more belief. So it can't be revised, it can't be modified, it can't be built upon. It's stagnant. It does not change over time. Whereas science does change and evolve and continually improves as new information is discovered. Science is facts. Pseudoscience is faith. Just believe me because I say so. One of the things that makes science and pseudoscience difficult to differentiate is because they both publish information in all kinds of formats. And they also both use scientific concepts and terminology. In fact, pseudoscience goes out of its way to use scientific concepts and terminology in order to make their case sound better than it really is. What about which one does the public need to evaluate the credibility of, science or pseudoscience? In fact, they really need to evaluate the credibility of both. Not all science is well designed or properly interpreted. So it must be evaluated as well as pseudoscience. In fact, that's really what peer review is. What about tentative science? Tentative science is science on the cutting edge, new discoveries that are being made. It's just at the starting point of the peer review process. Well, it depends. It can become science if they advocate rigorous testing and review by their peers. But it can also become pseudoscience if instead they suppress the rigorous testing and review by peers. What about bad science? Bad science is poorly designed experiments or studies, or perhaps the data has been interpreted using some faulty logic. Should that be science or pseudoscience? Again, it really depends. Bad science can be science as long as they advocated rigorous testing and review by peers and they then accept those results. If the scientific community rejects their claim, then they are willing to acknowledge that. Whereas bad science can become pseudoscience if instead they reject those reviews by their peers and want to still present their claim as though it is sound science that has been accepted by the scientific community after going through rigorous peer review, when in fact that is false. So the main difference between pseudoscience and mainstream science in a nutshell: if you were to ask a scientist or a pseudoscientist what would change their mind, here's how they would respond. A scientist would say, evidence. Evidence is what would change my mind. Whereas the pseudoscientist would simply say, nothing. There is nothing that can change my mind. So how are science, tentative science, and pseudoscience each defined? Let's start with science. Science is driven by evidence that is testable and has gone through rigorous peer review. The claim may then be either accepted or rejected by the scientific community. Tentative science is at the starting point of peer review and has not yet been widely tested. It will only become a science after rigorous peer review. Pseudoscience crops up in two different ways. One is when tentative science is falsely presented as science, and the other is when claims are not testable experimentally, and so rigorous peer review is simply impossible because there is no experiment that can be done to test the claim.